Hey, welcome back, friend. Pull your blanket a little closer, turn the lights down if you haven't already, and tonight we're going somewhere most history books never bother to take you, not to the battlefield, not to the throne room, but to the quiet, complicated lives of women who lived almost 1,000 years ago. And I promise you what they chose to do and why they chose it is going to surprise you. Here's something I want you to sit with for just a second before we go any further. Imagine waking up one morning as a 12-year-old girl in medieval Europe. Your father calls you into the main hall. There's a man standing there you've never seen before. He's older, maybe 30, maybe 40, maybe older than that. And your father tells you with a completely straight face, "This is your husband." No asking, no choosing, no how do you feel about this, just this is your life now. And here's the thing that really gets me, this wasn't the rare, horrible exception, this was Tuesday. Now if that already has your brain buzzing with questions, you're exactly where I want you to be. Because tonight's story isn't just about the horrors of medieval marriage, though we will absolutely get into that. Tonight's story is about something much more quietly radical. Is about the women who looked at that world, looked at those options and said, no, I'm going to find another way. Some of them ran to convents. Some of them defied their families for years, hiding in barns and forests and borrowed rooms just to protect that choice. Some of them walked through those convent doors and emerged as writers, scientists, composers, diplomats, women whose names we still say out loud today. This is their story. And I think by the time we're done tonight, you might see the Middle Ages and maybe even some corners of the modern world in a completely different light. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying these kinds of stories, the ones that take history and actually feel it, not just recite it, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you'd take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. I make these for people who love falling asleep to stories that actually matter. And your support is what keeps this going. And hey, I'm always curious, where are you watching this from tonight? Are you tucked in bed in a quiet house sitting up late because you can't quite switch off yet? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and I genuinely love knowing who's out there on the other end of this. Now dim the lights, let the world get a little quieter, and let's begin. Let's set the scene properly. We're talking about medieval Europe, roughly from the year 500 all the way through to around 1450. About 1,000 years of history, 1,000 years of women navigating a world that had essentially two doors. Door number 1, marriage. Door number 2, the convent. That's it. Those were your options. And before we talk about why so many women chose the convent, we need to spend a little time really understanding what was actually behind door number 1. Because here's the thing, we tend to picture medieval marriage through a kind of romantic haze. Castles, flowing gowns, knights pledging devotion. The reality was considerably less poetic. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, marriage was not a romantic arrangement. It was a legal contract between two families. And the commodity being exchanged, the woman. Under the legal framework that dominated most of medieval Europe, a framework built heavily on Roman law and later shaped by canon law, which is the law of the Catholic Church, a wife was not an independent legal person. Once she married, she essentially ceased to exist as a legal entity. Her property became her husband's property. Her body under church teaching was considered available to her husband, essentially on demand. Her children belonged to her husband's family. Even her name in many cases dissolved into his. The 12th century legal scholar Gratian, one of the most influential voices in canon law, wrote that a husband held lawful authority over his wife's body. Not in a gentle, poetic, we belong to each other kind of way. In a legally enforceable, institutionally backed, there is no appeal kind of way. Now I want to be fair here because the Middle Ages were not a monolith. 1,000 years is a long time. Laws varied by region and by century, and some women, particularly wealthy widows, did hold real power and real property. But for the vast majority of women, especially young women, entering marriage for the first time, the picture was stark. You were in the eyes of the law and the church a dependent, an appendage, a vehicle for children and alliance-making. Let's talk about age for a moment, because this is the part that modern people often find hardest to sit with. Under canon law as it was codified by the 12th century, a girl could be formally betrothed as young as 7 years old. 7. And while the church specified that the marriage couldn't be consummated until the parties were older, the standard typically cited was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Betrothal itself locked a girl's future in place before she was barely old enough to understand what marriage even meant. The legal scholar Hortensius, writing in the 13th century, put it in terms that are difficult to read with modern eyes. He essentially argued that once a girl was physically capable of consummating a marriage, she was ready for it. And in practical terms, even the theoretical protections of canon law were frequently ignored. A famous and deeply uncomfortable popular saying from the period captures the atmosphere around these arrangements rather candidly. Medieval scholars documented the phrase, "No man marries without regretting it." Now think about that for a moment. That's the men saying it. Imagine what the women were thinking and not saying. Now let's talk about what happened after the wedding, because this is where it gets really difficult. Medieval childbirth was, to put it plainly, one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 women died in childbirth during the medieval period, though some estimates for specific populations run even higher. And women in this era didn't have 1 or 2 children, they had many, sometimes 6, 7, 8, 10, as long as their bodies and lives held out. The historian Eileen Power, whose groundbreaking work on medieval women remains essential, reading documented numerous cases of young aristocratic women who died before their late 20s, their bodies simply exhausted by repeated pregnancies with no meaningful medical support. The Church's position on the matter was theologically consistent, even if it was humanly brutal. A wife's primary purpose after chastity and obedience was to produce children, to bear that burden, to endure it if necessary. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most towering theological minds of the Middle Ages, a man whose ideas shaped Catholic doctrine for centuries, wrote that a man who slept with his wife purely for pleasure was, in his words, behaving like an adulterer. The purpose of the marital bed was reproduction. Pleasure was sinful, desire was dangerous. And all of this applied to a young woman who in many cases had never spoken more than a handful of words to the man she was bound to for life. Now, I don't want to paint every medieval marriage as a horror story, because that would be its own kind of oversimplification. There were marriages built on genuine affection. There were husbands who were kind and families who made thoughtful matches. Medieval literature is full of love poetry, of longing and devotion of couples who clearly adored each other. But here's the thing. Even the good marriages were built on a foundation of profound inequality. Even in the best case, a medieval wife had no legal recourse if things went badly, no realistic route out, no professional path that existed outside the household, no property she could call her own. And I think it's important to sit with that, not to condemn an entire era, but to truly understand why when certain women looked at the other door, that quiet, candlelit, complicated door of the convent, they saw something that looked less like a sacrifice and more like a lifeline. Let me introduce you to one more detail before we move on, because it reframes everything. In medieval Europe, a woman who entered a convent paid what was called a spiritual dowry. It was in most cases significantly less than the financial dowry required to secure a marriage. I know what you're thinking. Wait, so entering a convent was literally cheaper than getting married? Yes. For noble and wealthy families navigating the brutal arithmetic of inheritance families with multiple daughters and limited estates, this economic reality was enormously consequential. We'll dig much deeper into that in a little while. but I want you to hold that thought because it contains within it one of the central paradoxes of this whole story. The convent was simultaneously a place of genuine spiritual refuge, a tool of family financial management, a haven for the brilliant and the creative, and for some women a cage that closed around them before they were old enough to understand what they were agreeing to. It was all of those things at once, and separating the threads, figuring out which women chose which women were pushed, and which women somehow found freedom inside a system that wasn't designed to give them any, is where this story gets truly extraordinary. So that's the world. Cold, unequal, beautiful in its way, but shot through with a set of rules that placed women at the very bottom of every legal and social hierarchy. And yet out of that world came some of the most remarkable women in all of human history. Women who wrote and composed and healed and led. Women who corresponded with emperors and defied popes. Women whose words are still being read and studied and sung almost 900 years later. But before we meet them, we need to understand the other door more fully. What exactly was the medieval convent? Because I promise you, whatever image just formed in your mind, the reality is far more interesting. Stay with me. So now you know what was waiting behind door number 1. And honestly, just sitting with that for a moment, the legal invisibility, the age of those brides, the sheer physical toll of what was expected, I think most of us would start looking pretty hard for another option. Which brings us to that second door, the one that so many women chose, or were pushed toward, or stumbled into, or fought their way toward with everything they had, the convent. And here's where I need to ask you something directly, because I think it matters. What do you actually picture when you hear that word? I'm being serious. Close your eyes for half a second if you want. What comes up? Cold stone hallways. Silence grey, robes and bowed heads. Women cut off from the world, counting their days in prayer and obedience. If that's the image in your mind, I completely understand. It's the image most of us inherited from films, from novels, from a cultural shorthand that reduced medieval convent life to a kind of gentle imprisonment. But here's what the actual historical record shows us, and I have to warn you, it's a lot more interesting than the shorthand. Let's go back to the very beginning of how these places came to exist. The earliest Christian monasteries, places where both men and women withdrew from the world to pursue God, appeared in the deserts of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries. They were radical, almost anarchic spaces. Women like Mary of Egypt, Syncletica of Alexandria, and the desert mothers known collectively as the Amas. These women were sought out by pilgrims who came from hundreds of miles away just to sit at their feet and hear them speak. Not because they had titles, not because they had husbands or powerful fathers behind them, but because people believed they had wisdom, real wisdom, the hard one tested in the fire kind. That's where this whole tradition begins. Not in submission, but in something that looked, if you squinted it right, almost like authority. By the time we reach the early medieval period in Europe, roughly the 5th through the 8th centuries, something remarkable was happening in the Christian world. The monastic tradition had travelled north and west, taking root in Ireland, England, France, and the Germanic territories. And in this particular period, before later church reforms tightened the rules considerably, a number of these early monasteries were what historians call double houses, institutions that housed both monks and nuns, often under the leadership of a single abbess. I want to pause on that for a second. Not an abbot, not a male superior, an abbess, a woman in charge. One of the most famous of these early double houses was Whitby Abbey in the northeast of England, founded in the year 657, under the leadership of Abbess Hild of Whitby. Now, Hild is someone who deserves far more name recognition than she gets. She presided over a community of both men and women. She trained 5 future bishops under her roof. And in 664 she hosted the Synod of Whitby, one of the most important church councils in the history of English Christianity, the meeting that determined how the English Church would calculate Easter and which form of monasticism it would follow. Kings attended this synod, bishops debated and deferred, and the woman who convened it, who shaped the agenda, who provided the space and the institutional authority for the whole thing to happen, Hild, an abbess. I think about Hild sometimes when people talk about medieval women as though they were universally powerless. Because the evidence sitting right there in the 7th century says not always, not if you knew which door to walk through. Now, and this is where the story starts to get genuinely complex. The early freedom that characterized those first centuries of women's monasticism did not last. From roughly the 9th century onward, a series of church reforms began systematically narrowing what nuns could do and where they could go. The concept of clausura, complete enclosure behind convent walls, became increasingly enforced. Nuns who had once travelled, taught, received visitors, corresponded freely with the outside world, found those freedoms progressively curtailed. By the end of the 13th century, Pope Boniface VIII issued a sweeping decree that all religious women of whatever order were to be fully cloistered. No leaving the convent. No receiving male visitors without formal oversight. No public ministry. And this is the version of convent life that most of us picture because it's the version that was eventually codified into law and became the dominant image. But here's what I find endlessly fascinating as someone who has spent a lot of time with this history, even within those walls, even after the doors were locked and the rules were tightened. Something kept happening that the male church authorities did not fully anticipate. Women kept learning, women kept writing, women kept thinking. And this is the key insight that changes everything. Convents had libraries. Let me tell you why that matters more than it might sound. In medieval Europe, literacy was not a universal given. Far from it. For most ordinary people, men and women alike, reading and writing were inaccessible skills. You didn't need them to farm, to trade at a local market, to raise children. And without formal institutions to teach them, most people simply never acquired them. But convents ran on literacy, the divine office. The cycle of daily prayers that structured convent life required reading the Psalms aloud in Latin multiple times a day. To be a choir nun, the primary rank within most convents, you had to be able to read. And once you could read Latin, the intellectual language of all of medieval European civilization, a door opened. Because Latin was the language of medicine, of philosophy, of theology, of natural science, of history, of music theory. A literate nun in a well-stocked convent library had access to the entire accumulated written knowledge of the Western world. And a woman at home managing a household, raising children with no formal education and no time that wasn't spoken for by domestic demands. She had almost none of it. I genuinely think this point doesn't get made strongly enough in popular history. The convent was not just a spiritual refuge. It was for many women the only institution on earth that would teach them to read. And we have the written proof of what happened when those women had time to think. The nun Hroswitha of Gandersheim, a Benedictine sister living in what is now northern Germany in the 10th century, wrote 6 plays in Latin. Plays in the 10th century. She modelled them deliberately on the comedies of the ancient Roman playwright Terence, but she rewrote the endings. Where Terence's women were seduced and ruined, Hroswitha's women were clever, faithful, and triumphant. She was essentially doing what good writers have always done, taking the tools that exist and quietly bending them toward a different vision. She also wrote epic poetry and saints' lives, and she was self-aware enough to write about her own intellectual journey in her prefaces, moments of humour and self-deprecation, mixed with a completely unself-deprecating confidence in the value of what she was producing. She is by any reasonable measure one of the great literary figures of the early medieval period, and she was a nun. Not despite being a nun, because she was a nun. But here's a question worth asking because I think intellectual honesty requires it. Was the convent actually a free space for women? Or was it just a different kind of cage walls traded for walls, obedience to a husband, traded for obedience to a church hierarchy? And the honest answer is both, sometimes simultaneously. The convent gave women community education protection from the specific dangers of marriage, the possibility of leadership and access to learning. Those things were real and they mattered enormously. But it also operated within a male-supervised church structure. Abbesses had to answer to male bishops and abbots. The rules governing convent life were written by men, and as we noted, those rules tightened considerably over time. The historian Eileen Power, writing in the early 20th century, put it beautifully when she described the convent as simultaneously a refuge for female intellectuals and a space shaped by the very patriarchal structures it offered an alternative to. It contained both truths at once, and I think that tension between the freedom the convent genuinely offered and the limitations it still imposed is what makes this history so deeply human. Because most of us know what it's like to find freedom within a constrained space. To make a life within the borders of what's possible, even when possible, doesn't mean everything you'd want. Let me bring this into slightly sharper focus with a detail that I find quietly staggering. Historians who study medieval women's writing have noted something striking about the written record. The vast majority of texts authored by women that survived from the medieval period were written by nuns. Not because women outside convents had nothing to say, but because women outside convents rarely had the literacy, the time, the physical materials, or the institutional support to put their thoughts on parchment and to have those pages preserved, copied, and passed down through the centuries. The convent, for all its limitations, was the institution that made women's voices part of the permanent historical record. Every time we read a medieval woman's words today, every time we hear her music, encounter her theology, follow her reasoning about medicine or the natural world, we are in almost every case reading the work of a woman who chose or was given or fought her way into that second door, and I find that worth sitting with for a moment. Not as a simple triumph, not as a simple tragedy, but as something genuinely complicated, genuinely human, and genuinely extraordinary. Now here's something that might shift your thinking about this entire subject. We've been talking about the convent as a spiritual institution, as a place of prayer, of learning of God, and all of that is true. But there's another dimension to this story that we haven't touched yet, one that was for many medieval families actually the primary consideration when they decided where to send their daughters. Money. Cold hard, entirely unsentimental money. Because it turns out that the economics of medieval marriage was so brutal, so relentlessly demanding on the families of young women, that the convent wasn't just a spiritual option. For thousands of families across Europe, it was a financial strategy. And once we pull that thread, once we see what a medieval dowry actually cost, and what happened to families that couldn't afford it, and what the numbers looked like in places like Florence and Venice and Paris, this whole story changes shape again. Because suddenly we're not just asking why some women chose the convent, we're asking who was doing the choosing. And the answer might surprise you. Right, money. Let's talk about money, because I have to be honest with you, when I first started going deep into this particular corner of medieval history, I expected the story of women and convents to be primarily a spiritual one. A story of faith, of calling, of women seeking God in the quiet of a candlelit chapel, and that story is absolutely real. We'll spend a lot of time with it, but underneath it, running through it like a cold underground river, is this other story. This thoroughly unromantic, entirely human story about family finances, inheritance strategy, and the brutal math of what it cost to be a daughter in medieval Europe. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with a number. In Florence, Italy, in the year 1427, the city conducted one of the most detailed censuses of the medieval world, a document historians call the catasto. It recorded households, their members, their assets, and their debts with remarkable precision. And what it revealed about the economics of marriage was striking. A typical dowry for a middle-class Florentine bride in that period ran to somewhere between 300 and 600 florins. Now, to put that in context, a skilled craftsman in Florence at the time earned roughly 30 to 50 florins a year. So we're talking about 6 to 20 years of a working man's entire income. For one daughter to get married once, and if you had 2 daughters, 3, 4. The arithmetic becomes genuinely catastrophic. The dowry system in medieval Europe was not a gentle tradition of gift-giving. It was a legal obligation, one that fell almost entirely on the family of the bride. When a woman married, her family was required to provide her husband with a substantial sum of money, property, or goods. This was the dowry, and once it was handed over, it became, in most legal systems, the property of the husband to manage as he saw fit. The ostensible purpose was to provide for the wife in the event of her husband's death. In practice, it functioned as a payment from one family to another, in exchange for taking a daughter off the first family's hands. I realize that sounds harsh, but that is genuinely how the legal structure worked. And here's the part that is almost darkly funny if you can find the humor in it. The dowry inflation problem in medieval Europe was real, documented, and widely complained about. As aristocratic and merchant families competed for the most advantageous marriages that would secure alliances, consolidate land, expand trade networks, dowry expectations kept climbing, higher and higher, decade by decade. Families that couldn't keep up found their daughters increasingly unmarriageable, at least within their own social class, and a daughter who married beneath her social station, that was its own kind of catastrophe, because the social status of children followed the father. Marrying down wasn't just personally embarrassing, it was a permanent generational demotion for your family line. So you had this impossible bind dowries too expensive to pay, and the alternative of marrying down too damaging to accept. What did families do? They sent their daughters to convents, and here's the financial logic laid bare. The spiritual dowry, the payment required to enter a convent, was almost universally lower than a marriage dowry, sometimes dramatically so. For a family with multiple daughters and limited resources, the calculation was straightforward, if not exactly loving. One daughter gets the full marriage dowry and a husband. The others go to the convent. It wasn't framed that way out loud, of course. It was dressed in the language of vocation and devotion and God's will. But the ledgers tell their own story, and nowhere does this story play out more vividly or more dramatically than in Venice. Venice in the 16th and 17th centuries was one of the wealthiest cities in the world and one of the most rigidly stratified by class. The Venetian patrician class, the old noble families who ran the city's government and commerce, operated under a set of social rules so restrictive they bordered on self-destructive. A patrician woman could not marry beneath her class without catastrophic social consequences. But the number of eligible patrician men was limited and growing more so, as some families chose to remain unmarried rather than divide their wealth through multiple marriages. The result was mathematically inevitable. Between the years 1550 and 1650, a full century historical records show that aristocratic women in Venice were statistically more likely to become nuns than wives, more likely to enter a convent than to marry. In some of the most prominent Venetian families, the majority of daughters, not a small minority, but the majority, spent their lives behind convent walls. Not because they all felt called by God, but because the city's economy and its class structure had quietly, systematically run out of other options for them. Now I want to ask you something here, and I genuinely mean this as a question worth thinking about. Is that a choice, when a 12-year-old girl is placed in a convent because her father cannot afford another dowry, or because there are no suitable husbands of the right social standing, is she choosing the convent? The honest answer is, it depends on who you're asking and when in her life you're asking it. Because here's what's fascinating about the historical evidence. Many women who entered convents as children, placed there by families who'd made purely financial calculations, grew into the life, found meaning in it, built identities and communities and intellectual lives they genuinely valued. The records we have of nuns writing about their own lives are full of genuine devotion, genuine friendship, genuine intellectual joy. But the records are also full of something else: frustration, longing for the outside world, open resistance, and occasionally outright rebellion, and both things can be true at once. There's a letter that has always stayed with me, though I should say its exact origin is debated among historians. It comes from the account of a young woman in Italy in the late 18th century, recorded during a period of convent reform. She'd been placed in a convent as a young girl, educated there, grown up inside those walls. She wrote to a male patron, a man with enough social influence to help her, and she described herself as being held in chains. That's the word she used. Chains. And the patron unusually, remarkably listened. He arranged for her release and helped secure a marriage. I think about that letter sometimes, about the specificity of that word. Not constrained, not limited, not unfulfilled. Chains. And I think about all the women who felt the same way but had no patron to write, no way out, no letter that anyone preserved. History keeps the stories of the extraordinary. It's much quieter about the ordinary. But here's the counterweight to that story, because this history demands counterweights. For some women, the convent was not chains. It was the opposite of chains. Consider the economic reality of the alternative for a moment. A woman who married in medieval Europe handed her entire financial life over to her husband. Whatever she brought into the marriage, her dowry, any property she might inherit, became his to manage. If he was financially reckless, she suffered. If he gambled it away, she had no legal recourse. If he died without making proper provision, she could be left destitute. A woman in a convent, by contrast, was part of an institution. The convent owned land. It had income from rents and donations. It had a community of women who shared resources and looked after one another. And while a nun technically took a vow of personal poverty, the institution itself, particularly in wealthy convents, could be remarkably well-resourced. Some convents in medieval France and England held vast agricultural estates. Some in Italy maintained elaborate gardens, workshops, and scriptoria writing rooms where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. The abbess of a major convent managed budgets, negotiated with merchants, corresponded with bishops and nobles, and exercised authority over a community that could number in the dozens or even hundreds. For the daughter of a noble family who might otherwise have spent her life deferring to a husband she didn't choose, managing his household, bearing his children, and having no independent legal standing, the abbess's chair represented something genuinely different. Something that looked, if you were willing to call it by its real name, like power. Let me give you one specific example that I think crystallizes this whole tension beautifully. The city of Florence, the same Florence whose 1427 census. We look to earlier established a government institution in 1325 called the Monte delle Doti. The name translates roughly as the dowry fund. It worked like a savings scheme. A father could deposit money into the fund when his daughter was young, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old, and by the time she was of marriageable age, the fund would have grown, providing the necessary dowry. This sounds on the surface almost progressive, a planned savings system, financial security for daughters. But look at what it actually reveals. The Florentine government felt it necessary to create a state-funded institution to help families afford the basic social requirement of marrying off their daughters. The dowry burden had become so enormous, so structurally destabilizing, that the city itself had to intervene to keep the marriage market functioning. And even with the Monte delle Doti, many families still couldn't manage it for all their daughters. The convent remained the overflow valve, the financial release, the place where extra daughters went. And yet, and this is the turn I always come back to, the thing that keeps pulling me into this history, even within that reality, even in that context of economic calculation and family convenience, something else was quietly happening. Because when you take a girl, even a girl placed in a convent against her wishes or simply without being asked, and you give her 10, 20, 30 years inside an institution with a library with other educated women, with time to think and read and practice music and write, something tends to grow. And what grew in convents across medieval Europe in women who arrived as children, with no say in the matter, was sometimes breathtaking, not always, not for everyone, but with enough frequency and with enough force that the history of medieval women's intellectual life is in large part the history of what happened when women were given or found enough space to think. The question of who those women were, what they thought, and what they left behind for us, that's where we're going next. Because this is the part of the story I find most extraordinary. The part where the chains for some women turned into wings. There's a word I keep coming back to when I think about this part of the story. The word is agency. We've spent the last little while looking at the structural forces, the legal frameworks, the financial pressures, the family calculations that pushed women toward convents, whether they wanted to go or not. And those forces were real, undeniably, documentably real. But if we stop there, we make a mistake that I think does a quiet disservice to some of the most remarkable people in this entire history. Because among the women who chose the convent, there were those who chose it with everything they had. Not because their fathers couldn't afford a dowry, not because there were no suitable husbands, not because the church needed bodies to fill pews and say prayers, but because something inside them, something fierce and specific and entirely their own, would not be satisfied with anything else. And fighting for that choice in the world we've been describing took a kind of courage that honestly makes me catch my breath when I read the accounts carefully. Let me tell you about Christina. Christina of Marchiate was born around the year 1096 into an Anglo-Saxon family in the English town of Huntingdon. Her family was prosperous, well-connected, socially ambitious. Her father had cultivated useful relationships with powerful Norman nobles in the years after the conquest, and like any sensible family of their standing, they had plans for their daughter, plans that involved marriage, alliance. To her family it was a careful arrangement, the quiet, deliberate use of marriage to strengthen status, secure alliances, and place their daughter where she could best serve those ambitions. Christina from an early age seemed to be moving along a different path. At 14, and it is worth pausing on how young that is, she made a deeply personal commitment during a visit to a shrine of the Virgin Mary. It was not something announced or formally recorded, not a declaration meant for others to witness, but a private promise shaped by her own sense of devotion. And then her family found her a husband. His name was Beortred. He was a young man of suitable social standing. The betrothal was arranged, the contracts were drawn up, and the machinery of medieval marriage began moving forward with the slow, inevitable weight of a millstone. Christina refused. Her family was not amused. What followed was a period of pressure and manipulation that reads even across 900 years as genuinely distressing. Her parents tried persuasion first, then social pressure. Then they brought in a bishop, a man named Ranulph Flambard, who was both a senior church official and by most historical accounts not exactly a model of clerical virtue, to convince her. That effort failed. Then they tried something more aggressive. They arranged for Beortred to be alone with Christina in her bedroom, apparently in the hope that the situation would resolve itself. Christina talked her way out of it. Twice. On the second occasion, she spent the night telling her would-be husband the story of a saint who'd convinced her own husband to live in chastity rather than consummating their marriage. Whether Bjortred found this charming or simply baffling, the historical record does not specify, but he left without having touched her. At this point, Christina's family escalated to what I can only describe as a campaign of domestic pressure, so sustained and so creative in its awfulness that it has its own section in the historical accounts. She was kept under close supervision. She was prevented from attending church services where she might encounter sympathetic clergy. She was subjected to what the record describes as repeated public humiliation designed to break her resolve. An ecclesiastical judge was, according to the account, bribed to set aside her private vow of virginity, declaring it legally invalid so that the marriage could proceed. And then the marriage took place, formally legally in the eyes of the church. But Christina still refused to consummate it. And in medieval canon law, a marriage that had never been physically consummated was technically not an indissoluble sacrament. There was still technically a way out, so she ran. With the help of a local hermit named Roger, a man who apparently had both the theological conviction and the logistical nerve to assist her, Christina escaped. She hid for 2 years with a woman named Alfwen, an anchoress, who sheltered her in conditions that the historical account describes as genuinely difficult. A small dark space, almost no room to move, the constant fear of discovery. Then she was moved to a hermitage at Marchiate, where she lived hidden for 4 more years. 4 years. Think about that. She spent the better part of a decade in hiding in cramped and uncomfortable spaces, cut off from her family, in legal jeopardy, sustained by a network of people who risked social and ecclesiastical consequences to protect her choice. All of this, every bit of this, because she had made a private vow at 14 and refused to let the world talk her out of it. And here's the thing that I find most striking about Christina's story, not the drama of the escape, not the years in hiding, but what came after. Once she was finally free, once her marriage was formally annulled, once she was able to take proper religious vows, she didn't simply disappear into quiet obscurity. She became a spiritual director of significant reputation. The hermitage at Marchiate, where she eventually settled formally, became a place that powerful men sought out for counsel and prayer. Among them was Geoffrey of St. Albans, a senior abbot who formed a close and documented friendship with Christina that lasted decades and resulted in genuine mutual support. He provided material resources for her community. She provided, by all accounts, spiritual guidance he genuinely valued. A woman who'd been legally invisible, economically controlled, physically constrained, ended up as a sought-after counsellor to some of the most powerful men in the English Church. The stubbornness that her family had seen as a problem turned out to be, in the context she eventually found, a kind of strength. I want to pause for a moment and ask you something personal. Have you ever wanted something badly enough that you were willing to be genuinely uncomfortable for it? Not inconvenienced, not mildly put out, but actually uncomfortable. For years. Because when I read Christina's story carefully, that's what strikes me most. Not the romance of it, not the cinematic quality of the escape, but the sheer grinding, unglamorous endurance of it. Years in small dark spaces, years of uncertainty, years of being called foolish and disobedient and worse. And she held on. Whatever you think of the theological framework she was working within, and people can and do disagree about that, there is something in that story that I find genuinely moving, something that has nothing to do with the medieval church and everything to do with what it means to know what you want and refuse to let the world take it from you. Now let me take you somewhere entirely different geographically and in character. Central Italy, the year 1212. A young woman of 18 slips out of her family's house in the middle of the night. She is the eldest daughter of one of the most prominent families in the city of Assisi. Her father is a wealthy cloth merchant. Her social position is secure. Her future by any conventional measure is promising. And she's walking alone through the dark toward a small chapel on the edge of town called the Portiuncula. Waiting for her there is a man named Francesco. We know him as Francis of Assisi, and a small group of his followers. And what happens next changes her life entirely. She kneels. Francis cuts her hair. She exchanges her fine silk dress for a rough tunic. And Clare of Assisi, daughter of the Offroduccio family, future founder of her own religious order, future doctor of the church, becomes a nun. Now, I want to be careful here because Clare's story is often told as a kind of beautiful, simple renunciation, a wealthy girl who gave it all up for God. And while that's not wrong, it's not the whole picture. Because what Clare built over the following decades was not simplicity, it was a revolution. The religious order she founded, the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares, was from the beginning defined by her insistence on what she called the privilege of poverty. This sounds paradoxical, so let me explain it. Most women's religious orders in the medieval period were endowed with property. They owned land, received rents, held assets that provided institutional security. And the male church hierarchy, the bishops and popes and cardinals who oversaw these institutions, maintained significant control precisely through the management of those material resources. Clare wanted something different. She wanted her community to own nothing, to live entirely on what they grew and what was given to them each day. And she fought for that vision with extraordinary tenacity. For nearly 40 years, through multiple popes, through repeated attempts by the male church hierarchy to impose a more conventional property-owning rule on her community, Clare held the line. She wrote her own rule for her order. Let that sink in for a moment. In the entire history of the medieval church, the rule of St. Clare, written by Clare herself for her own community in the year 1253, is the only monastic rule written by a woman that was ever officially approved by the medieval papacy, the only one in over 1,000 years of Christian monasticism. There's a detail about the end of Clare's life that I find almost unbearably moving. She'd been fighting for papal approval of her rule, her version of her rule, not the watered-down version that various popes had tried to substitute for years. She finally received the official papal bull of confirmation on August 9th, 1253. She died the following day. Whether that timing was coincidence, or whether it was the result of a woman who had simply been holding on long enough to see one specific thing accomplished, I cannot say with certainty, and neither can historians. But I know which interpretation I find more true to the character that emerges from the documents. She finished her work, and then she was done. What strikes me looking at both Christina and Clare together is how different their personalities were. Christina was fierce and private. Her resistance was individual, personal, carved out of pure individual will. She didn't found anything. She didn't change any rules. She just stubbornly and at great personal cost refused to be made into something she wasn't. Clare was also fierce, but her fierceness was institutional and visionary. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom, she was building something, creating a structure that would allow generations of women after her to live according to a principle she believed in. Two completely different kinds of strength, two completely different expressions of the same fundamental refusal. The refusal to let the world define what a woman's life was allowed to look like. And here's what I keep coming back to, the thought that I can't quite shake after spending time with these stories. Both Christina and Clare operated entirely within the framework of their faith. They didn't reject the church. They didn't argue that the system was wrong. They worked within the constraints they had, and sometimes bent those constraints with remarkable creativity, which raises a question that I think is worth sitting with quietly as we continue. What does it mean to find freedom within a system that wasn't built to offer it? Because that question, that specific, complicated, thoroughly human question, is going to keep coming back to us in this story. And the woman we're going to meet next took it further than almost anyone else in this entire history. She didn't just find freedom within the system, she found a way to make the system answer to her. Her name was Hildegard, and if I had to choose one single person from this entire history, one life that captures everything we've been talking about, all the contradictions and the possibilities and the sheer astonishing human potential that the convent could contain, it would be her, Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098 in a small village called Bermersheim, in what is now the Rhineland region of Germany, the 10th child of a minor noble family, 10 children. Let that number settle for a moment, because in the context of everything we discussed about medieval childbirth and what it cost women's bodies, 10 children means her mother survived something that killed a great many women of her era. That alone is its own quiet story. But the child we're concerned with tonight is the 10th, the last one. Little Hildegard, who from the age of 3 began seeing things that no one around her quite knew what to do with. She described them later in life as a kind of living light, not visions in the dramatic thunderclap sense we might picture, not voices booming from the sky, something gentler and stranger and harder to name, a luminosity that suffused her perception of the world, that carried with it information, or what felt like information about the nature of things. She told her parents. Her parents, to their credit, did not dismiss her, but they also did not quite know what to do with a child who saw light that others couldn't see. In a deeply religious culture, the possibilities range from divine gift to something considerably more troubling. Their solution in the year 1106, when Hildegard was 8 years old, was to place her in the care of a woman named Jutta von Sponheim at the Monastery of Disibodenberg. And here is where I want to be precise about something, because the popular telling of this story sometimes glosses over it. Hildegard was not placed in a convent because her parents were cruel or indifferent or couldn't afford her dowry. She was by the customs of the time given to the church as what was called an oblate, a child offered to God in part because her parents genuinely believed her visions were sacred, and in part because the monastery was the only institution that had any framework for understanding and nurturing whatever it was she carried. In a strange way, the convent was the most rational response available to a family who had a daughter who was different, in ways that the ordinary world had no category for. Now, Jutta von Sponheim. I want to spend a moment here because Jutta tends to get overlooked in the telling of Hildegard's story, and she deserves better. Jutta was a young woman only 6 years older than Hildegard, who had herself refused both marriage and conventional convent life, and chosen instead to live as an anchoress, a solitary at Disibodenberg. She was by all accounts one of the sharpest minds in the region. She taught young Hildegard to read, to write, to play the psaltery, a stringed instrument, something like a small harp. She introduced her to the Psalms, to Latin, to the rhythms of monastic life. What strikes me about this relationship is its intimacy and its intellectual quality. This was not a child being warehoused. This was a child being formed by a woman who herself had chosen a path outside the conventional, who had fought for that choice, who understood from personal experience what it meant to want something the world around you couldn't quite accommodate. The relationship between Jutta and Hildegard lasted 30 years until Jutta's death in 1136. By that point, what had begun as a solitary cell had grown into a proper community of nuns, and when Jutta died, the community unanimously elected Hildegard, then 38 years old, as their new leader. And here is where everything changes. Because Hildegard at 38 was not the careful, deferential figure that the male church hierarchy might have expected, to inherit leadership of a small women's community. She was someone who'd been watching and reading and thinking and quietly accumulating a kind of inner authority for 3 decades. And now she had institutional authority to go with it. In 1141, 5 years after becoming head of her community, Hildegard had an experience she described as transformative, a command as she understood it to write down what she saw and knew. She'd been keeping her visions largely private for most of her life. This, she felt, was no longer acceptable. She began to write. What emerged over 10 years of labour with the assistance of a monk named Volmar, who served as her secretary, and a young nun named Richardis von Stade, was a work called Civias. The name comes from the Latin phrase meaning "know the ways of the Lord." It was a visionary theological text unlike anything that had been produced before it. Not a commentary on existing scripture, not a collection of prayers, a completely original work of mystical theology illustrated with extraordinary images describing in precise and poetic language a vision of the cosmos, of human nature, of the relationship between creation and its creator. Pope Eugenius III, the reigning pope, read portions of it at the Synod of Trier in 1147 and 1148 and gave it his official endorsement, a woman's theological writing, officially approved by the Pope in the 12th century. If you understand how unusual that is, you understand something essential about who Hildegard was. But the writing was in a sense only the beginning. Let me tell you about the music, because I think it's the thing that most surprises modern people when they first encounter Hildegard. She composed, not in the sense of arranging existing melodies or setting standard text to familiar tunes, both of which were entirely common in monastic music. She composed original music, new melodies, new structures, a body of sacred songs that musicologists today describe as unlike anything else from the 12th century, technically anomalous, melodically adventurous, with a soaring quality that still sounds extraordinary when performed. Her largest musical work, the Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum, which translates as the Symphony of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations, contains 77 original compositions, 77. Hymns, sequences, antiphons, a complete liturgical cycle, all original. She also wrote what is generally considered the oldest surviving morality play, with music, the Ordo Virtutum, the Play of Virtues, a dramatic work in which personified virtues battle for a human soul. Opera didn't formally exist yet as a genre, but Hildegard was doing something that looked in retrospect remarkably like its ancestor. And then there was the medicine. This is the part that surprises people perhaps most of all. Hildegard wrote 2 major works on natural science and medicine. The first, known as Physica, catalogued the medicinal properties of plants, animals, stones and metals with a systematic thoroughness that was genuinely unusual for her time. The second, Causae et Curae, Causes and Cures, addressed human physiology, illness and treatment. She wrote about the 4 humours, the dominant medical theory of her era, but she also included observations and recommendations that appear to derive from genuine clinical knowledge. She described remedies using specific herbs, detailed preparations, specific dosages. Some historians have suggested that the convent at Disibodenberg and later at Rupertsberg likely functioned as a place where sick people came for care, and that Hildegard's medical knowledge was grounded in real practice, not just inherited theory. She also invented something extraordinary, an entirely original language. It's called the lingua ignota, the unknown language. It has a vocabulary of approximately 900 words and its own alphabet of 23 letters. Why she created it, scholars still debate. Perhaps for use within her community, perhaps as an experiment in the nature of language itself. Perhaps, and I find this possibility quietly thrilling, simply because she could. Because her mind worked at a scale that the available tools couldn't quite contain, and so she made new ones. Now, I want to be honest about something here because I think intellectual honesty requires it. Not all historians are uncritical admirers of Hildegard. Some have noted that her medical works contain material that was conventional for her time. The four humours framework was universal, not original to her. Some have pointed out that her visions, while genuine to her experience, were interpreted through the theological assumptions of her era in ways that reinforce certain hierarchies rather than challenging them. She accepted clerical authority. She worked within the church, not against it, and her community at Rupertsberg was notably exclusive. She admitted only women of noble birth, and there is a documented letter exchange in which she defended this practice in terms that are difficult to read charitably. She was a product of her time in the ways that all of us are products of ours. But here's what I keep coming back to. A woman born in 1098, placed in a monastery at 8 years old, who went on to correspond with 4 popes, 2 emperors, the King of England, the King of France, and more abbots and bishops than historians have been able to count, who composed music still performed today, wrote theology still studied today, described visions still debated today, who did all of this while managing 2 convents, conducting 4 preaching tours across Germany, and fighting institutional battles that would have exhausted most people decades younger. That woman was not a product of her circumstances. Her circumstances were the container. What she put in it was entirely her own. There's one story about Hildegard that I want to close this section with because I think it says more about her than any list of accomplishments. In 1150 she announced to the abbot of Disibodenberg, the man who technically held authority over her community, that she had received a divine vision directing her to move her nuns to a new independent location at Rupertsberg near the town of Bingen. The abbot said no. Hildegard went to the Archbishop of Mainz, who said yes. The abbot still said no. And then Hildegard, this 62-year-old woman who had spent her entire life inside monastic institutions, took to her bed and refused to move. Not in a passive, resigned way, in a completely intentional way. She described her paralysis as a divine judgment on those who are blocking God's will. Whether or not you accept the theological framing, the strategic brilliance of the move is undeniable. She made herself immovable until the abbot relented. He relented. She built her convent at Rupertsberg. She ran it on her own terms for the rest of her life. She died in 1179 at approximately 81 years old, a remarkable age for anyone in the 12th century, let alone someone who had reportedly been unwell for most of her life. I've read a lot of history. I've spent a lot of time with figures from across the centuries, and I can say with genuine conviction Hildegard of Bingen is one of the most complete human beings I have ever encountered in the historical record. Writer, composer, physician, theologian, linguist, administrator, diplomat, prophet. None of those things would have been possible, not one of them, if she'd married at 12 and spent her life managing a household. The convent gave her the space to become whatever she actually was, and what she actually was turned out to be almost impossibly large. But Hildegard was in some ways an exceptional case, a towering figure, the kind of person who might have found a way regardless of what circumstances they were born into. The more interesting question, the one that keeps pulling at me, is what about the women who weren't exceptional? The ones who didn't compose 77 original musical works or invent their own language. What did the convent give them? What did it mean for an ordinary woman to live her life inside those walls? Because the extraordinary figures get the spotlight. They always do. But the ordinary ones, the ones whose names we don't know, whose letters weren't preserved, whose music was never written down, they were the fabric of this whole story. And their experience of convent life was in many ways more complicated, more varied and more human than anything Hildegard's singular brilliance can show us. That's where we're going next. And I promise you the ordinary story turns out to be anything but. Picture a room, Small stone-walled north-facing so the light comes in cool and steady without glare. A wooden desk, a quill, a shallow dish of ink mixed from oak galls and iron salts, a formula that medieval scribes spent years perfecting, and in front of you a sheet of parchment that took the skin of an entire calf to produce. You have perhaps 4 hours of good daylight left. You begin to write. This is the scriptorium, the writing room of a medieval convent. And what happened in rooms like this across hundreds of convents in France and Germany and England and the Low Countries over several centuries is one of the most quietly consequential stories in the history of human knowledge. Not because the women in those rooms were all geniuses, but because they showed up every day and they did the work. Let me give you a number that I think deserves more attention than it typically gets. Before the invention of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century, every single book in Europe was made by hand. Every one. If you wanted a copy of the Psalms, a medical text, a work of philosophy, a collection of sermons, someone had to sit down with ink and parchment and copy it word by word, letter by letter. This was not a casual undertaking. A skilled scribe working steadily could produce perhaps 4 or 5 pages of careful text in a day. A substantial book of 200 pages might take 2 months of dedicated work, assuming no errors, no illness, no interruptions. Monasteries, both male and female, were the primary institutions where this copying happened. They maintained the scriptoria, trained the scribes, preserved the materials. And here's the thing that gets lost in the broader story. Nuns copied books not just as devotional labour, not just as a way of occupying idle hands. They copied books because books were the convent's economic resource, its intellectual currency, its connection to the wider world of ideas, and for some women, the medium through which they eventually began producing original work of their own. The act of copying is also, if you do it long enough, an act of deep absorption. You cannot copy a text carefully, attentively, word by word for weeks without that text working its way into your thinking, without it changing how you see the world. Every nun who sat in a scriptorium and copied theological works was in the process receiving a theological education, whether anyone intended it that way or not. There is a woman I want to tell you about who I think perfectly embodies what this kind of education could produce. Her name was Herod of Hohenberg, and she was the abbess of a convent on a hilltop in the Alsace region, which today sits on the border between France and Germany in the second half of the 12th century. Herod completed her most remarkable work around the year 1180. She called it the Hortus Deliciarum, the Garden of Delights. It was an encyclopedia, not a small one, a comprehensive systematic attempt to gather together the sum of human knowledge as understood in the 12th century theology, philosophy, history, natural science, poetry, and arrange it in a form that the young women in her convent could understand and learn from. She wrote portions of it herself. She compiled and edited extensively from existing sources, and crucially she commissioned illustrations. The Hortus Deliciarum contained somewhere in the range of 336 miniature illustrations, making it one of the most extensively illustrated manuscripts of the entire medieval period. It was in the most literal sense a textbook, a teaching tool, created by a woman for women to give the young nuns under her care access to the full intellectual inheritance of the Christian world. Now I have to tell you something about this manuscript that I find genuinely heartbreaking. The original survived intact through the medieval period, through the Reformation, through centuries of European upheaval. And then in August of 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, the library where it was housed was destroyed by fire. The original Hortus Deliciarum no longer exists. What we know of it survives only through copies and scholarly descriptions made before the fire. An encyclopedia created by a woman in the 12th century, the most ambitious female scholarly project of the entire medieval period, survives today only as an echo of itself. I find that loss enormous, not just as a historical loss but as a human one. But let's come back to the act of writing itself, because I think we underestimate how radical it was. In medieval Europe, the dominant framework for understanding women's relationship to speech and knowledge came largely from a combination of biblical interpretation and ancient Greek philosophy. Women were considered in the prevailing theological and philosophical view more susceptible to error, more easily deceived, less capable of the sustained rational inquiry that was considered the foundation of the legitimate intellectual authority. St. Paul's letters, read and interpreted throughout the medieval period as binding guidance, contained passages that were understood to prohibit women from speaking in church, from teaching men, from exercising public authority over doctrine. The restrictions were not just cultural, they were considered theologically grounded, and yet, when a woman wrote a book and that book was read, copied, circulated, she was in a very real sense teaching. She was exercising intellectual authority over anyone who read her words and was changed by them. This is the quiet paradox at the heart of medieval women's writing. The written word allowed women to do something that oral speech in public contexts largely did not permit them to do. A woman could not stand in a pulpit and preach, with a very few extraordinary exceptions we've already met, but she could write something that sat on a shelf in a monastery library for 300 years and shaped the thinking of everyone who read it. The parchment was a kind of loophole, and the women of the medieval convent, whether or not they thought of it in those terms, used it. Which brings me to the woman I have been wanting to talk about for the last several minutes, Julian of Norwich, born around the year 1342 in or near the city of Norwich in eastern England. We know almost nothing about her early life. Her family background is uncertain. Her birth name is unknown. Julian is the name of the church to which her anchorite cell was attached, not a name she was born with. What we know is this. In May of 1373, when she was approximately 30 years old, Julian became severely ill. She believed she was dying. In the course of this illness, she experienced a series of 16 visions, she called them showings, centered on the suffering and love of Christ. She recovered, and for the next 20-plus years she thought about what she had seen. She wrote it down twice. First a shorter account closer in time to the experience, then a much longer, much more theologically developed account, the product of decades of careful reflection. The resulting work, known today as Revelations of Divine Love, is the first book in the English language known to have been written by a woman. The first in the entire history of written English. Now, what strikes me about Julian is not primarily the historical distinction of being first, remarkable as that is. What strikes me is the quality of the thinking. Julian was working in a tradition 14th century Christian mysticism that had a rich vocabulary and an established set of concepts. She was not operating outside it, but within it she did something that was genuinely unusual. She thought carefully, persistently, and with intellectual courage about the nature of divine love, and what she arrived at was a vision of that love that was, by the standards of her time, startlingly tender and startlingly inclusive. Her most famous line, and it is famous for a reason, is this: "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Written in 1473 during a century that had seen the Black Death carry away somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. A century of war, of social collapse, of widespread and entirely reasonable despair about the state of the world and whether God was paying attention. And Julian, from her small cell attached to a church in Norwich, having thought about her visions for decades, arrived at all shall be well. Not as a denial of suffering. She was meticulous about acknowledging suffering, but as a conclusion hard won and carefully argued about the ultimate nature of things. I want to be clear about where Julian lived when she wrote this. An anchorite cell was not a convent in the sense we've been discussing. It was smaller, much smaller, a room essentially, attached to the outer wall of a church, with a small window looking into the church so the anchorite could receive communion and hear the Mass, and a second window onto the street through which she could speak with visitors who came to her for counsel. Julian of Norwich lived in this cell for as far as historians can determine several decades. She did not leave. She chose this, and from that cell she became one of the most sought-after spiritual counsellors in England. Records indicate that Marjorie Kemper herself, a remarkable figure in the history of medieval women's spirituality, travelled to Norwich specifically to speak with Julian. People came from considerable distances to consult her through that small street-facing window. A woman who never left a room became through her writing and her counsel a presence that extended across the whole of England and eventually across the centuries. Here's the question this raises for me, and I want to ask you to think about it honestly. What do we do with lives that look from the outside like radical self-limitation and turn out from the inside to have been forms of radical expansion? Because that's what Julian's life presents us with. The anchorite cell looks like the smallest possible life, the most constrained, the furthest from freedom as we conventionally understand it. And yet inside it a woman produced a work of theology so original and so humane that it is still being read, still being studied, still being found consoling more than 600 years after she wrote it. I don't have a tidy explanation for that. I'm not sure there is one, but I think it matters that we sit with it, that we resist the instinct to either romanticize the constraint or dismiss it, that we hold space for the genuine possibility that freedom, real freedom, the kind that produces lasting work, sometimes looks nothing like what we expect it to look like from the outside. There's a thread running through Herod, through Julian, through the nameless scribes in the scriptoria, through all of it. And it's this: the written word in the medieval period was one of the few tools available to women that could genuinely outlast them. A woman's domestic work, the cooking, the managing, the raising of children, disappeared the moment she stopped doing it. It left no permanent mark on anything beyond the immediate circle of her family, but a woman's writing. A woman's writing could sit on a shelf for 300 years and walk into a room she'd never entered and speak to someone she had never met. That is not nothing, that is in some ways everything. And the women who understood that, who felt it, even if they couldn't have articulated it in those precise terms, who picked up the quill and put something true down on parchment and trusted that it might matter to someone somewhere someday. Those women made a choice that echoes forward to us right now in this conversation. But the intellectual life of the convent, as rich as it was, as genuinely liberating as it could be, was only one dimension of what it meant to live inside those walls. There was another dimension, one that the formal histories tend to treat as a footnote, but that I think is actually central to understanding why so many women found real life there. It was something simpler than theology and more complex than friendship. It was community. What did it actually mean day to day to live in a world made entirely of women? To have your relationships, your rivalries, your loyalties, your daily life structured not around a husband and children, but around a group of other women working toward a common purpose. What did that produce? And what did it cost? Because it produced extraordinary things, and it cost things too. That's where we go next. Let me ask you something that might seem like a strange question at first. If you could go back to medieval Europe, and I know none of us actually want to, but bear with me, and you had to choose between being the wife of a powerful lord or the abbess of a major monastery, which would give you more real practical day-to-day power over your own life and the lives of others, most people's instinct is to say the Lord's wife. Castle, wealth, social prominence, proximity to power. But here's what the historical record actually shows, and I think it might genuinely surprise you. To understand the abbess's position, you need to understand one fundamental fact about how medieval European society was organized. Land was power. Not abstract power, not symbolic power. Concrete enforceable daily power over the lives of real people, the tenants who farmed the land, the villages that sat on it, the roads that crossed it, the markets that operated within its boundaries, and medieval convents, particularly the major well-established ones, founded by royal or aristocratic patrons, owned a great deal of land. The Abbey of Fontevraud in the Loire Valley of France, founded in the early 12th century, eventually controlled a network of priories across England, France and Spain. It was governed throughout most of its medieval history by an abbess, not a male superior, an abbess. The Abbey of Essen in what is now Western Germany, one of the great imperial abbeys of the Ottonian period, functioned essentially as an independent territorial power. Its abbess held the rank of an imperial princess. She sat in the imperial diet. She had the right to mint coins, meaning the abbess of Essen had the legal authority to produce the currency of the realm. I want you to hold that image for a moment because I think it fundamentally disrupts the picture of medieval women as universally powerless. The legal title that described the status of a major abbess in the medieval German Empire was Reichsabtissin Imperial Abbess. It was not an honorific, it was a legal designation with specific enforceable privileges attached. An imperial abbess held her lands directly from the emperor, not from any intermediate lord. She owed him military service, which in practice meant she could be required to provide armed men for the emperor's campaigns funded from the revenues of her estates. She presided over her own court. She had judicial authority over her tenants and dependents, the power to hear disputes, impose fines, administer justice within her territories. She could negotiate contracts, receive oaths of loyalty, grant land, enter into alliances. She was in the most technical sense of medieval feudal law a lord. A female lord operating within a system designed by and largely for men, but a lord nonetheless. Now compare this to the legal position of a married woman of equivalent social standing. Under the legal doctrine known in English common law as coverture and similar principles operated across most of medieval Europe, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not sue in court independently. She could not sign contracts. She could not own property in her own name. She could not make a will without her husband's consent. A married countess living in a castle presiding over a great household might appear from the outside to wield enormous social power, and in practice she often did managing estates when her husband was absent, raising children, supervising large staffs of servants, exercising significant social influence. But in law, she was her husband's dependent. The abbess of a major monastery, by contrast, was legally her own person. She could sue. She could be sued. She could sign documents that were legally binding. She owned the institution's property and trust and managed it with genuine authority. When historians talk about medieval women who held real legal independence, the abbess is almost always the central example, because she is almost the only example. Let me give you a specific woman who I think makes this concrete in a way that abstract legal analysis cannot quite achieve. Her name was Euphemia, and she was abbess of Warewell Abbey in Hampshire, England, in the middle of the 12th century. Warewell was a Benedictine house founded in the late 10th century with substantial land holdings across southern England. The Chronicle of Warewell Abbey, a document that survives and has been studied by medieval historians, records what Euphemia accomplished during her tenure. She rebuilt the church. She constructed new buildings for the community. She reorganized the abbey's finances, which had apparently been in some disorder before her arrival. She negotiated with neighbouring landowners over boundary disputes. She managed the abbey's agricultural operations with enough skill that the institution's economic position improved substantially under her leadership. The chronicle describes her in terms that are striking for their directness as someone who governed with both spiritual authority and practical competence, who was as comfortable negotiating a land agreement as she was leading her community in prayer. This was not unusual for a capable abbess. It was in fact expected. The role required it. Here's something I find genuinely fascinating about the abbess's position that I don't think gets enough attention. The skills required to run a major medieval monastery were almost identical to the skills required to run a medieval estate or small principality. Financial management, personnel oversight, legal negotiation, agricultural planning, construction supervision, diplomatic correspondence, crisis management, and here is the crucial difference between the abbess and the lord's wife. The lord's wife learned and exercised these skills in support of her husband's authority. The abbess learned and exercised them in support of her own. When a medieval lord died and his son inherited the wife's authority, typically diminished unless she was a widow with specific legal provisions. When an abbess died, her successor inherited an office with its full powers intact, and that successor was chosen in most cases by the community itself. The nuns elected their own leader. In a world where almost no woman had any formal say in who governed her, the choir nuns of a medieval convent elected their abbess. That is an extraordinary thing. Now I want to be honest here, and complicate the picture slightly because the history demands it. The abbess's power was real, but it was not unchecked. She operated within a church hierarchy that was overwhelmingly male. She answered to a bishop. In many cases, her community was affiliated with a male monastery whose abbot held formal supervisory authority. We saw this with Hildegard, the long grinding battle with the abbot of Disibodenberg just to move her community to a new location, and over time, across the medieval period, the male church hierarchy made consistent efforts to curtail abbatial independence, to bring women's houses more firmly under male supervision, to reduce the scope of what an abbess could do without seeking permission from a male superior. The great imperial abbesses of the early medieval period, the coin-minting, diet-sitting landholding powers of the Ottonian era, gradually had their privileges eroded as the church reform movements of the 11th and 12th centuries tightened ecclesiastical discipline. So the story is not one of steady, triumphant female authority. It is more complicated than that. More interesting, I would argue. It is the story of women finding and exercising real power within a system that simultaneously enabled and constrained them, and the ongoing, never fully resolved tension between those two forces. But let me bring this down from the level of institutions and legal frameworks for a moment. Because what I actually find most compelling about the abbess's position is not the land or the legal privileges, it is the daily texture of what leadership meant inside those walls. Think about what a medieval abbess actually did day to day. She was responsible for the spiritual welfare of every woman in her community. That meant knowing them, their strengths, their struggles, their temperaments, their conflicts with each other. She was the final authority on disputes within the house. When two nuns had a falling out, and medieval convent records make absolutely clear that nuns had falling outs, sometimes spectacular ones the abbess arbitrated. She was the person who dealt with the outside world on the community's behalf, visiting bishops, merchants, delivering supplies, families inquiring about their daughters, donors seeking prayers in exchange for gifts. She was the institution's public face, its internal governor, its spiritual mother, and its chief executive, all simultaneously. And she was doing all of this in a world that provided very few models for female leadership. There was no established playbook, no tradition of female executives she could study and imitate. She was to a significant degree working it out as she went. Can I ask you something personal for a second? Think about a woman you know or have known who leads with that particular quality, the one who manages people and problems and crises without making it look like management. who holds a community together through the sheer force of her attention and care. I think most of us, if we're honest, know exactly who comes to mind. And I think most of us also know that this kind of leadership, the kind that is relational and attentive and community-oriented rather than hierarchical and command-based, tends to be undervalued or even invisible in how we tell stories about power. We tell stories about the general and the king and the emperor. We tell far fewer stories about the person who held the community together, while the general was off fighting, who made sure the institution survived, who knew everyone's name, and remembered their particular fears and particular gifts. The medieval abbess was that person. At a scale and with a consequence that deserves to be part of the story, we tell about power in the Middle Ages. There is a document from the Abbey of Romsey in Hampshire, another major English Benedictine house that has always stayed with me. It is a record of legal proceedings from the 13th century in which the Abbess of Romsey is documented as appearing in royal court to defend the abbey's property rights against a claim by a neighbouring landowner. She appeared in court, in person, in the Royal Court of England, argued her case, and won. The record is dry and technical in the way that legal documents tend to be. It does not tell us her name or what she wore or whether she was nervous, but it tells us that she stood in one of the most powerful legal forums in medieval England and made an argument and prevailed. And I find myself wanting to know her, wanting to have been in that room, because in a century when a married woman of equivalent social standing could not appear in court at all without her husband's representation, when her legal voice was simply not recognized as independent, this woman walked in and spoke for herself. That is not a small thing. That is, in the world she inhabited, almost revolutionary. So we have in the figure of the medieval abbess something genuinely paradoxical. A woman who achieved real, documented, legally recognized power more than almost any other woman in her society by stepping entirely outside the primary social role that society had designed for women, by not marrying, by not producing children, by entering an institution that from the outside looked like withdrawal from the world, and from inside that institution exercising more authority over more people, more property, and more consequential decisions than the vast majority of her married contemporaries ever would. The withdrawal turned out to be in the most practical and earthly sense an advancement, and yet the power of the abbess was always institutional, always tethered to the office and what the office allowed. There were women in medieval Europe who sought something different, not institutional power, not the authority that came with a title and a set of legal privileges, but something rawer and stranger and harder to contain, a direct, unmediated relationship with God. Women who bypassed the entire institutional framework, the convents, the rules, the male supervisors, the approved channels, and went looking for the divine on their own terms. Women who did not fit into either of the two doors we've been discussing. Women who carved a third way through solid stone, and their story, the story of the Beguines, the mystics, the wanderers who refused every available category, is one of the most remarkable chapters in this whole extraordinary history. That is where we are headed next. Something happened in the cities of Northern Europe in the early 13th century that the medieval church genuinely did not see coming. And when it did see it, when it finally understood what was emerging in the streets and alleyways of Bruges and Ghent and Cologne and Paris, its response told you everything you needed to know about what power really feared. But let me back up, because to understand this story, you need to understand one specific problem that the medieval world had quietly been accumulating for decades. A problem so mundane it barely sounds like history, but which turned out to be genuinely explosive in its consequences. There were too many women, not in some vague general sense, in a very specific demographically documented sense. Medieval European cities, particularly in the Low Countries and the Rhine Valley, had a significant surplus of women relative to men. historians have offered various explanations: male mortality from warfare and dangerous labour men entering monasteries in larger numbers, in certain periods patterns of migration. Whatever the cause, the result was a population of women who could not find husbands, not because they were unsuitable, but simply because the arithmetic didn't work, and these women needed somewhere to go. The convents couldn't absorb them all. The dowry requirements alone made formal religious life inaccessible to most women who weren't from wealthy families. Marriage was as unavailable. The convent was unaffordable. And so with the particular creativity of people who have run out of sanctioned options, some of these women invented something new. They called themselves or were called beguines. The origin of the word is still debated by historians. Some trace it to a Flemish term, some connect it to the name of a particular priest. Some suggest it may originally have been a term of mild mockery that the women themselves eventually adopted with pride. What they were in practice was this: women who chose to live together in small shared houses or in larger communities called beguinages without taking formal religious vows. They did not swear permanent chastity. They could leave at any time. They did not swear poverty. They worked weaving, nursing the sick, caring for the poor, and they kept their earnings. They did not swear obedience to a male superior. They governed themselves. They prayed. They cared for the sick and the dying. They read scripture often in the vernacular languages French, Dutch, German, rather than in Latin, which meant they were making sacred texts accessible to ordinary people in a way the institutional church hadn't authorized. And they were by most accounts enormously popular. At the movement's peak in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the number of beguines in certain cities was staggering. In Cologne alone, one of the largest cities in the medieval German world, historians estimate that somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 beguines were living in the city at the same time. In the city of Ghent, records suggest that by the late 13th century, roughly 15% of the adult female population was living in beguinages. 15% in a single city. This was not a fringe movement. This was a mass phenomenon, a grassroots, largely self-organized, financially independent network of women living outside both the household and the cloister. And the church watched it grow with an expression that I can only describe from the historical record as deep and escalating unease. Now, why exactly did the beguines make the church so nervous? It is worth thinking about carefully, because the answer is more interesting than simple institutional hostility. Part of it was theological. The beguines were not under the formal supervision of a bishop or an approved religious order. They had no rule. No one was checking their theology for errors. And in a religious culture where the line between genuine mystical experience and dangerous heresy was considered extremely important and extremely easy to cross, accidentally unsupervised religious women were a genuine concern. Part of it was social. The beguinage model suggested that women could create stable, functional, self-sufficient communities without male governance, without husbands, without male superiors, without the institutional frameworks that men controlled. If that idea spread, if it became normalized that women could simply organize themselves and live well and do meaningful work and engage in serious spiritual practice entirely outside male authority, what did that say about the necessity of male authority in the first place? I think that question was what really alarmed people, not the theology, not even the living arrangements. The implicit argument that women were capable of governing themselves. And then came Marguerite. Marguerite Porret was a beguine from the county of Hainaut, which sits today on the border between France and Belgium. We don't know her birth date. We don't know much about her early life. What we know is that she wrote a book. She called it Le Miroir des Simples Âmes, the Mirror of Simple Souls. It was a work of mystical theology written in Old French rather than Latin, in the form of a dialogue between the soul of and reason, and it was extraordinary. The Mirror of Simple Souls described a spiritual journey in which the soul, through stages of deepening union with God, eventually transcended the need for external religious structures for the Church's sacraments, for priestly mediation for the apparatus of institutional religion. The soul, in the highest stage of union that Marguerite described, was absorbed into the divine will so completely that it required nothing from the outside, no priest, no church, no institutional mediation of any kind, just the soul and God. Now, I want to be precise here because Marguerite is sometimes presented in modern retellings as having been condemned simply for being a free-thinking woman, which flattens a genuinely complex theological situation. The ideas in her book were, from the perspective of the medieval church's framework, genuinely dangerous. Not because the church disliked mysticism, it produced centuries of mystics, some of them women, but because the specific claim that the soul at its highest point transcended the need for the institutional church undermined something the church considered foundational to its entire authority structure. The church's power rested partly on its claim to be the necessary mediator between humanity and God. Marguerite was arguing in beautiful and carefully constructed prose that mediation was ultimately optional. That is not a small theological disagreement. That is within the framework of medieval Catholic doctrine a fundamental challenge. The Church's response was methodical and escalating. Margaret's book was first condemned by the Bishop of Cambrai around the year 1300. She was ordered to stop circulating it. She continued circulating it. She was warned again, more formally, with more explicit consequences attached. She continued circulating it. And here is the detail that I find most striking about Marguerite's story, more than the theology, more than the trial, more than the eventual outcome. She had by multiple accounts been warned clearly about what the consequences of continued defiance would be. She understood the situation she was in, and she kept going anyway. She sent copies of her book to 3 senior theologians and church figures, apparently seeking validation, or perhaps simply making the record clear about what she believed and was willing to stand behind. In 1308 she was arrested. She spent approximately 18 months in prison, during which she refused to speak to her inquisitors, not because she was broken or defeated, but because she had apparently decided that the tribunal had no legitimate authority over her conscience, and she would not dignify its proceedings with her participation. She was asked repeatedly to recant. She refused. On June 1st, 1309, Marguerite Porrette was burned in the Place de Grève in Paris. She was approximately 40 years old. The crowd that watched her execution was, according to contemporary accounts, moved to tears by her composure. I want to sit with that image for a moment because I think it demands to be sat with. A woman who wrote a book about love, who refused to stop sharing it even when the consequences became clear, who chose at the last to go silently to her death rather than say that what she had written was wrong. Whatever you think of the theology, and people still debate it today because the Mirror of Simple Souls was rediscovered in the 20th century and is now considered an important work of medieval mysticism, the human story here is stark and extraordinary. This was not a woman who stumbled into confrontation accidentally. She made choices repeatedly with full awareness of what they cost. That is a particular kind of courage that deserves to be named clearly. Now, Margaret's story is sometimes used to illustrate the simple point that the medieval church was cruel to women who stepped out of line. And while that is not wrong, it is not complete. Because what happened after her execution is part of the story too. The Mirror of Simple Souls. The book she died for was not destroyed. It survived. Copies continued to circulate anonymously across Europe for centuries. Medieval readers, monks, nuns, laypeople, theologians continued to read it, copy it, find meaning in it, without always knowing who had written it or what she'd paid. It was translated into Latin, into Middle English, into Italian. It was read in contemplative communities across Europe throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. And then it was lost, or appeared to be lost. In the 20th century, a scholar named Romana Guarnieri identified a previously anonymous manuscript as Marguerite's work. The Mirror of Simple Souls had survived 600 years. The institution that condemned it had changed beyond recognition. The book was still being read. What I find most fascinating about the Beguine movement as a whole, beyond any individual story, is what it reveals about what women did when the sanctioned options ran out. They did not simply accept unavailability. They built something. Without institutional support, without male authorization, without the legal protections that formal religious life provided. They built communities, they developed spiritual practices, they produced theology, they cared for the sick and the poor, they wove cloth and sold it and used the money to sustain themselves. They were not waiting to be saved or permitted or included. They were simply doing what needed doing and trusting that the doing of it was enough justification. There is something in that impulse, that refusal to wait for permission, that I find genuinely moving and genuinely modern in a way that surprises me every time I come back to it. Think about this for a second. We've spent parts of this story inside the convent, inside the institution, with its rules and its libraries and its structures. And now we've been outside it with the Beguines, the women who refused the institution but still needed community, still needed meaning, still needed a way to live that was honest to what they were. Both groups were trying to solve the same fundamental problem, the problem of how a woman in a world designed around different assumptions was supposed to find a life that actually fit. The convent said, "Come inside. We have structure. We have safety. We have community and learning and sometimes real authority." The Beguines said, "We'll build our own outside." Both answers produced remarkable things. Both answers had their shadows. But there is a third chapter to this story that we haven't touched yet. The chapter about the women inside convents whose experience was not liberation or learning or power, but something darker and more complicated. The women who were there against their will, who wrote letters in the language of chains, who stared at the walls of places that were supposed to be sacred and felt something that had no sacred name. That chapter is difficult, and it is absolutely necessary, because the full truth of this history contains both the light and the dark held together, and we owe it to all these women, the ones who chose and the ones who didn't, to look at the whole picture honestly. The hardest stories to tell are the ones that don't resolve cleanly, the ones where there is no villain you can point to with confidence, no hero who gets everything right, no moment where the music swells and the injustice is clearly named and justice clearly arrives. This is one of those stories, and I want to tell it carefully because these women deserve care. We have been for most of this journey in the company of women who found something real inside the convent walls. Women who wrote and led and thought and refused and built. Women whose stories are in the most honest sense genuinely inspiring. But history has an obligation to the full picture, and the full picture includes this. For every woman who walked through the convent door and found space to breathe, there was another woman for whom those same walls closed like a trap. For every Hildegard who flourished, there were unnamed daughters who sat in stone rooms and counted the years and felt something that they may not have had words for, but that we looking back can recognize clearly. They were grieving a life they never got to live. Let me take you to Venice in the year 1646. A woman named Arcangela Tarabotti sits in the convent of Sant'Anna, where she has lived since she was 11 years old. Her father placed her there. Not because she was called by God, not because the family couldn't afford a dowry, though that was a factor, but because she had a physical disability, a limp that her father considered an impediment to an advantageous marriage. Tarabotti was by any measure one of the sharpest minds of her century. She read voraciously, she wrote prolifically, she maintained an extensive correspondence with some of the most prominent intellectuals in Venice, men and women who sought out her conversation and her opinions. And she spent 36 years in a convent she'd never chosen, writing, among other things, one of the most furious and lucid critiques of forced monarchization ever committed to paper. She called it paternal tyranny. The title says everything. She argued in direct, unsparing, often angry prose that fathers who placed their daughters in convents against their will were committing an act of violence against both the daughters and against God. That the convent, when used as a dumping ground for inconvenient daughters, was being profaned, its sacred purpose corrupted by the cynical calculations of men who cared more about their family finances than about their children's souls. She wrote, a girl placed in a convent without a true vocation is like a bird in a cage, alive but robbed of everything that makes life worth living. Her work was controversial enough that it circulated in manuscript during her lifetime, and some of it was published only under modified titles. She never left the convent. She died there in 1652 at the age of 48. But she left behind a written record that says with absolute clarity this was wrong, and I think we owe it to her to hear it. Now, Tarabotti was writing in the 17th century, but the problem she described had been documented and debated by the Church itself for centuries before her. Here's a detail that I find genuinely revealing. In 1563, the Council of Trent, the great reforming council that reshaped Catholic practice in response to the Protestant Reformation, issued specific regulations about the admission of women to religious life. One of those regulations was this: before a woman took her final permanent religious vows, she was to be examined by a bishop or his representative to ensure that her vocation was genuine and her consent was freely given. The fact that this had to be legislated, that it had to be written into official church law as a requirement, tells you something important. It tells you that before 1363 this examination was not reliably happening, that women were taking permanent vows without anyone in authority formally asking them whether they actually wanted to. The reform acknowledged implicitly that the system had been operating without this basic safeguard. And even after the regulation was in place, enforcement was uneven. The examination happened. But examiners were members of the same social world as the families doing the placing. The pressure to find consent where it may not have genuinely existed was real and documented. Let me give you a sense of what enforced convent life actually looked like from the inside, beyond the philosophy and the legal frameworks. The clausura, the strict enclosure that Pope Boniface VIII had mandated in 1298, and that the Council of Trent had reinforced, meant in its strictest interpretation that nuns were not to leave the convent under any circumstances. Not for illness, not for family emergencies, not for any reason, for the world came to them through a series of carefully controlled interfaces. The parlatorio. The parlour was a room divided by a grille through which nuns could speak with approved visitors. In stricter houses, a cloth veil was hung over the grille so that the nun could not even be clearly seen. The ruota, the revolving wheel built into the convent wall, was how objects passed in and out. You placed something in the wheel on one side, rotated it, and it appeared on the other. Food came in through the wheel. Letters came in through the wheel. In more than one documented case, so did contraband books. The convent was not supposed to have small luxuries correspondence that was not supposed to pass. The women inside knew the rules and in many cases worked creatively around them. Which brings me to Venice in the 18th century, and I want to tread carefully here because this is a part of the history that tends to get told in ways that either sensationalize or moralize, and I want to do neither. By the early 18th century, Venice had a serious and well-documented problem with its convents. The same demographic and economic pressures that had been sending noble daughters into convents for 2 centuries had produced In a number of Venetian houses, communities that were, to put it diplomatically, not entirely focused on contemplative religious life. These were women educated, socially sophisticated, often genuinely cultured, who had been placed in institutions designed for a kind of life that many of them had never chosen, and they adapted. Venetian convent parlours in this period were, by multiple contemporary accounts, lively social spaces. Music was performed, conversation flourished, fashionable visitors came and went. One contemporary observer noted, with a mixture of amusement and scandal, that the gowns worn by certain Venetian nuns at the grill were cut in the latest fashion from the finest silk and embroidered with pearls. Giacomo Casanova, whose memoirs, or whatever else you think of him, a remarkably detailed document of 18th century Venetian life, described his visits to convent parlours as among the most intellectually stimulating social encounters available in the city. He wrote about nuns who were witty, well-read, politically aware, musically accomplished. Women who had been denied one life and constructed within the available constraints a different one. I find myself genuinely ambivalent about how to read those accounts. On one hand, the ingenuity, the refusal to simply disappear into the role assigned, the construction of a social and intellectual life out of whatever materials were available. On the other hand, the materials were so limited, the constraints so real, the women so far from anything they had chosen. Both things are true simultaneously, and sitting with that ambivalence is, I think, the only honest response. Here's the question I want to put to you directly, because I think it matters. When we look at women who were placed in convents against their will, but who then built rich inner lives, found community-developed skills, produced work, are we celebrating their resilience? Or are we in danger of using their adaptation as a way to minimize the injustice of the system that constrained them? Because I think there is a real risk in telling this history of sliding from look how much they accomplished despite the constraint into, well, the constraint couldn't have been that bad then. And those are very different conclusions. Tarabotti was brilliant and productive and connected and intellectually alive until the day she died. And she called what was done to her tyranny. Both of those things are true, and neither one cancels the other out. There is a particular letter I want to read you, or rather to describe to you, since the exact translation matters, that comes from the correspondence of a young nun in a French convent in the 17th century. She writes to a benefactor, a man of some influence, and describes her situation. She says she was placed in the convent at a young age by her family. She says she's never felt called to religious life. She says she is, in her words, suffocating. She asks him to help her leave. He does. He uses his connections to arrange for her release from her vows, a process that was legally possible but practically very difficult, requiring the approval of church authorities who were not predisposed to grant it easily. She leaves. She marries. And here is the detail that makes this story stay with me. She described herself after leaving as feeling for the first time in her adult life that she could breathe. Just that she could breathe. I think one of the things this history teaches us, if we're willing to learn from it, is how important it is to ask who is doing the choosing. We've spent much of this story with women who chose. Christina of Marchiate, who defied her family for years to protect her vow. Clare of Assisi, who ran toward the life she wanted. Hildegard, who bent a reluctant abbot to her will. The Beguines, who built something outside every available structure. Those stories are real and they are remarkable, but they share the screen in this history with a much larger and much quieter crowd of women who did not choose, who were placed, who were sent, who were deposited, and who then had to figure out what to do with a life they hadn't asked for inside walls they hadn't chosen among women they hadn't selected. Some of them found meaning anyway. Some of them found joy anyway. Some of them produced extraordinary work anyway. And some of them, like Tarabotti, spent their lives quietly furious about the injustice of it, and wrote about it with enough clarity and force that the fury survived them by 400 years. Every one of those responses deserves to be seen. Now here is something that complicates the picture further, and the picture needs complicating because that is what honest history does. Not all convents treated their residents equally. Medieval and early modern convents were in many ways mirrors of the social hierarchies outside their walls. Choir nuns women who had paid the full entry fee and took the complete set of vows occupied the upper tier. They participated in the full liturgical life of the house. They had access to the library, to the choir, to the formal community life. Lay sisters, converse, occupied a lower tier. They did the physical labour, cooking, cleaning, farming, maintenance. They participated in a simplified form of religious practice. They had fewer rights and fewer privileges, and in many houses the distinction mapped almost directly onto class. Women from wealthy or noble families became choir nuns. Women from poorer backgrounds became lay sisters. The convent, presented as a space outside the world's hierarchies, reproduced them with remarkable fidelity. Hildegard, we should remember this, explicitly admitted only women of noble birth to her community and defended this policy when challenged. Even the most extraordinary figure in this story was a creature of her social world in ways that sit uncomfortably with the vision of the convent as democratic sanctuary. So where does this leave us? We have across this history a space that was simultaneously a refuge for the brilliant and the educated, a cage for the unwilling, a platform for real female authority, a reproduction of social inequality, a site of genuine spiritual experience, a convenient solution to uncomfortable financial problems. All of these at once, in the same building, sometimes in the same century, sometimes in the same community. And I think the reason this history continues to matter, the reason it keeps pulling people back, keeps generating books and documentaries and debates among historians, is precisely because it refuses to resolve. It keeps asking us to hold contradictions without collapsing them into something simpler. The convent was good and bad and complicated, and different women experienced it in radically different ways. And the system that produced it was unjust in structural ways, even when individual outcomes were positive, and some women found real freedom inside it, and some women never stopped grieving the freedom they lost. All of that is true, and sitting with all of it honestly, without flinching from any corner of it, that is what this history asks of us. But there is still a chapter of this story we haven't reached yet. A chapter that pulls all of these threads, the freedom and the constraint, the choice and the coercion, the extraordinary individuals and the invisible ordinary women, into a single question. What does it mean for us right now in the world we actually live in? Because the story of medieval women and the convent is not just a historical curiosity. It is in ways that are sometimes startling in their directness, a mirror held up to questions we're still asking today, about what women choose, about what systems permit, about the gap between the two, and that is where we are going next. Let me tell you about a problem that medieval men in the church had, a genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely fascinating problem. They had built something, the convent system, that was designed in large part to solve a set of practical issues. Where do unmarried women go? How do you manage female spirituality without it becoming disruptive? How do you provide a respectable framework for women who don't fit the marriage economy? Useful, tidy, manageable, except that it kept producing exactly the kind of women they were most afraid of. Learned women. Independent women, women with strong opinions about theology and the right to express them, women who ran institutions, commanded resources, corresponded with emperors, and in at least one extraordinary case went on preaching tours across Germany and told bishops to their faces that they needed to reform their behaviour. The system designed to contain female energy kept generating female power, and the response of the male church hierarchy to this paradox, the way it oscillated between enabling and suppressing, between celebrating and fearing, is one of the most revealing threads in this entire history. To understand it properly, we need to go back further than the medieval period, all the way back to the 3rd century and a theologian named Tertullian. Tertullian was a prolific and immensely influential early Christian writer based in North Africa. He was by most accounts a man of considerable intellectual gifts and equally considerable anxieties about women. He wrote in a passage that became one of the most quoted and contested texts in early Christian history, that woman was the gateway through which the devil entered the world. He was addressing women directly when he wrote it, telling them in essence that they carried within them a special capacity for destruction, that their very femininity was a kind of spiritual liability, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. Now, I want to be precise here and fair to the complexity of the historical record. Tertullian was not representative of all early Christian thought on women. Other early church writers had more nuanced or more generous frameworks, and Tertullian himself was complicated. He also wrote approvingly of women martyrs and acknowledged female spiritual gifts in certain contexts. But his suspicion of female spiritual authority, his insistence that even consecrated women had not escaped the constraints appropriate to their sex, that thread ran forward into the medieval church in ways that are clearly traceable and deeply consequential. Because here is the tension at the heart of the whole structure. The church taught that the soul had no gender. In the spiritual realm, the relationship between the individual soul and God was understood to transcend the categories of male and female. And yet, the institutional church, the hierarchy of priests, bishops, cardinals, and popes that mediated between ordinary people and God, was exclusively male. Women could not be ordained. Women could not administer the sacraments. Women could not hold formal teaching authority in the church. The gap between those two positions, the soul has no gender but the institution is all male-generated, enormous and never fully resolved tension throughout the entire medieval period. And the convent sat right at the centre of that tension, because the convent was the space where women's spiritual lives were acknowledged, encouraged, even celebrated, while simultaneously being supervised, controlled and kept within limits defined by men. The mechanism of that control was elegant in its design, if you can use the word elegant for something so thoroughly about power. It worked like this. Every women's religious house was required in canon law to have a male confessor, a priest, who heard the nuns' confessions and administered the sacraments. And in many cases, particularly in the early medieval period, women's houses were formally affiliated with nearby men's monasteries whose abbots held supervisory authority over them. This meant that even the most powerful abbess, even someone with the institutional gravitas of Hildegard, was technically operating under the oversight of a man. Not because he was more capable, not because he was wiser, but because the structure required it. The male superior was in many cases less educated than the abbess he supervised, less administratively experienced, less theologically sophisticated, and both parties often knew it. The correspondence between Hildegard and the successive abbots of Disibodenberg is, if you read it carefully, a masterclass in the performance of deference masking the reality of authority. She writes to them with appropriate formal humility. She then proceeds to do exactly what she had already decided to do. The system required her to ask permission. It did not in practice have much capacity to stop her, but the system's capacity to stop women grew over time, and this is where the history gets genuinely dark in a political rather than a personal way. In 1298, Pope Boniface VIII issued a decree called Periculoso. The name means roughly the dangerous one, referring to the danger that the Church believed unenclosed religious women, opposed to themselves and to the integrity of the institution. The decree mandated that all women in religious life of whatever order were to be kept in strict enclosure, no leaving the convent for any reason, no visitors admitted without specific authorization, no engagement with the outside world, complete clausura. This was not a new idea. The impulse toward enclosing women had been building for over a century before Boniface formalized it, but Periculoso gave it the weight of universal church law. And I want to ask you to think about the timing for a moment, because 1298 came after a century during which women's religious movements had been extraordinarily vibrant and active. The Beguines had flourished, new women's orders had emerged, female mystics had gained widespread reputations and significant spiritual authority. Women's religious life in the 13th century was in many ways more varied, more public-facing and more influential than it had been in previous centuries. And then came Periculoso, lock them in. The connection between the flourishing and the crackdown is not in my reading of this history coincidental. Power that is threatened tends to respond by narrowing the available space. There is a figure I want to bring into this conversation who has not appeared yet in our story, and who I think illuminates the male perspective on all of this with uncomfortable clarity. His name was Thomas of Celano, and he was the biographer of Francis of Assisi, the same Francis we met briefly when discussing Clare. Thomas wrote a biography of Francis that is one of our primary sources for the early Franciscan movement, and in it there is a passage about Francis's relationship with Clare and the women's community she founded that I find genuinely revealing. Thomas records that as the Franciscan movement grew, Francis became increasingly anxious about the presence of women within it, that he expressed privately a kind of dread about the spiritual and institutional complications that the women's communities were creating. Thomas frames this as Francis's humble recognition of his own spiritual limitations, but reading it with modern eyes and with everything we know about the institutional politics of the period, it reads rather differently. It reads like a man confronting the consequences of having perhaps inadvertently helped create something that the institution he inhabited did not have the framework to accommodate. Women who were genuinely spiritually serious. Women who had heard the same call he had heard and responded to it with the same conviction. Women who needed to be part of what he was building but whose inclusion created problems that the male structure of the church was not designed to solve cleanly. The anxiety was real. The source of the anxiety is the interesting part. Now, I want to be careful not to reduce this to a simple story of bad men oppressing good women, because that is not what the history shows. What the history shows is something more interesting and more difficult. It shows men who are genuinely caught between theological positions they held in good faith, about the nature of gender, the structure of the church, the dangers of spiritual pride in women, and the reality of women in front of them, who were demonstrably wise, demonstrably capable, demonstrably doing important work. Some of those men found ways to support and work with women, even within the constraints of their theological assumptions. Volmar Hildegard's secretary and confessor spent decades facilitating her work travelling with her community, serving as the practical support for one of the most remarkable intellectual projects of the 12th century. Pope Eugenius III, as we noted, read Hildegard's theological work and approved it a decision that required him to look at a woman's theological writing and say in effect, this is orthodox, this is valuable, this should be read. These were not small acts in their context, but they were also exceptional. The structure within which those men operated the assumption of male supervisory authority, the deep-seated anxiety about unsupervised female spirituality, the institutional reflex to enclose and control that structure remained and shape the available space for women throughout the entire medieval period and beyond. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this particular dimension of the history. The medieval church invested enormous energy in managing, supervising, limiting, and occasionally suppressing women's religious life. And despite all of that investment, despite the clausura, the required confessors, the supervisory abbots, the periodic crackdowns, women's religious life kept generating things that escaped the intended limitations. Hildegard preached publicly across Germany in her 60s, which no woman was supposed to be doing. Julian wrote theology that is still read and cherished today from an anchorite cell that was supposed to be the most limited possible form of religious life. The Beguines built a movement that, at its height, included tens of thousands of women operating almost entirely outside official supervision until the institution finally found the tools to dismantle it. Tarabotti published her fury at a system that was not supposed to be criticized from within. The women kept finding the cracks, keep making use of whatever space was available, keep producing things that outlasted the constraints they were produced within. And there is something in that pattern, that persistent, unglamorous, never fully suppressed creativity operating under sustained institutional pressure, that I find genuinely moving. Not because it makes the injustice acceptable. It doesn't. But because it says something about what human beings do when they have something real to express and the world is not quite willing to make room for it. They find the cracks. They always find the cracks. Which brings me to something I want to ask you, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Do you think the history of women in the medieval church would look different if the men who built and ran that institution had been less afraid, not less believing, not less devout, just less afraid of what learned, capable, spiritually serious women might do if given genuine room to operate? I think about that sometimes, about the books that might have been written, the knowledge that might have been preserved rather than suppressed. The theological arguments that might have developed differently. History does not deal in hypotheticals, but it does sometimes present us with what was possible, the glimpses of what brilliant women in constrained circumstances were actually capable of, and ask us to imagine what might have been possible without the constraint. And now we arrive at the question that this history has been building toward from the very beginning. The question that is not just historical, the question that connects the world of the medieval convent with all its complexity, all its contradictions, all its extraordinary and ordinary women to the world we are living in right now. Because when I look at the Beguines building their own communities outside every sanctioned structure, I see something that looks startlingly familiar. When I look at Hildegard bending an institution to her will from within, finding every available crack, refusing to be made smaller than she was, I recognize something. When I look at Tarabotti writing her fury into permanence from inside walls she never chose, I recognize something. And the question that keeps forming, the one I want to sit with you for just a little while longer, is what does this history actually mean for us, not as a lesson, not as a simple moral, but as a mirror? Because mirrors, if you're willing to look into them honestly, sometimes show you things you weren't expecting to see. That's where we're going next. Somewhere in South Korea right now, a woman in her late 20s is making a decision. She has a good job. She has her own apartment. She has a social circle and a life she's built with intention and care. And she's decided clearly and deliberately that she does not want to get married. Not because she hasn't met the right person, not because she's waiting, but because she's looked at the institution of marriage as it exists in her specific cultural context, the expectations, the labour distribution, the career penalties, the loss of social independence. And she has concluded that the cost is higher than any benefit she can identify. She is part of a movement that has been growing in South Korea for several years, a movement sometimes called by the name 4B, the 4 refusals, refusing dating, refusing sexual relationships, refusing marriage, refusing childbearing. It is a radical position and it has generated enormous controversy. But here is what struck me the first time I read about it seriously. I had heard this story before. Not in modern Seoul, in 12th century England, in 13th century Ghent, in the stone corridors of convents across medieval Europe. The specific vocabulary is different. The social context is different. The institutional alternatives are different. But the underlying question, what does a woman owe to a marriage system that was not designed with her full humanity in mind? That question is not new. It is very, very old. Now, I want to be careful here because I think the comparison between medieval women choosing convents and modern women choosing various forms of non-marriage deserves genuine intellectual seriousness rather than a superficial "see, nothing has changed." Things have changed enormously. A woman in most wealthy countries today has legal rights, professional opportunities and personal freedoms that would have been simply unimaginable to Christina of Marchiate or Arcangela Tarabotti. The legal doctrine of coverture, the absorption of a wife's legal identity into her husband's, has been dismantled across the Western world. Women can own property, sign contracts, practice professions, hold political office, appear in court in their own name. The economic calculus that made the convent an attractive alternative to marriage in medieval Europe was specific to a world of extreme female legal and financial dependency that no longer exists in the same form. So the comparison is not about equivalence, it is about pattern, and the pattern is this. In every era, in every culture, some women look at the dominant institution designed to organize their lives and say, quietly or loudly or in writing or in action, "This does not fit what I am." And then they do something about it. What that something looks like changes with the available options. But the impulse and the courage it requires and the social friction it generates, those remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. Let me give you another example that I think is genuinely striking in its echoes. In the past decade, researchers studying young women in Japan have documented a significant and growing phenomenon: women who are choosing to live in all-female shared housing communities, sometimes called women-only houses, or by various Japanese terms as a deliberate lifestyle preference. Not as a temporary measure while waiting for marriage, not as a financially driven compromise, but as a chosen way of living valued specifically for the community of women. It creates the sense of safety it provides, and the freedom from the social performances and obligations that mixed-gender living tends to require. Some of these communities have communal spaces for work and creativity. Some organize around shared interests, craft studies, specific professional fields. Some are explicitly focused on providing support networks for women navigating professional and personal challenges. I am not drawing a direct line between a modern Japanese co-living house and a medieval beguinage. But when I read about women deliberately building all-female communities oriented around work and mutual support and creative life, and opting out of conventional marriage structures in the process, I hear echoes that are hard to dismiss. The Beguines of 13th century Ghent would have found the vocabulary unfamiliar. The logic, I suspect, they would have recognized immediately. And then there is the question of what happens when women organize their intellectual and creative lives outside the structures designed to contain them. Because here is something that I think does not get said often enough in discussions about the modern creative and intellectual landscape: the explosion of women's creative output. In the past half-century, the novels, the music, the academic work, the journalism, the art coincided almost exactly with women's access to education and economic independence. That is not a coincidence. It is the same story that the medieval convents were already telling us in their own idiom. When women have access to education, time, resources, and a degree of independence from the demands of domestic labor, they produce extraordinary things. The convent understood this imperfectly, and for limited populations before almost any other institution in Western history. The modern university, the modern workplace, the modern city apartment. These are the contemporary versions of the same basic infrastructure, spaces that make it possible for women to think and create without giving everything else up first. But I want to push this further because I think there is a dimension of this comparison that tends to get missed. We talk a lot in contemporary culture about the tension between career and family, about the impossible juggling act, about the expectation that women should be able to do everything, have the career and the marriage and the children and the creative life and the beautiful home simultaneously and without complaint. And one of the things that strikes me most reading the medieval record carefully is how clearly those women understood something that contemporary culture sometimes struggles to articulate cleanly. You cannot do everything. Not because women are limited, but because time is finite, because attention is finite, because the kind of sustained deep work that produces lasting things requires a degree of single-mindedness, that genuine domestic life. The real demanding, relentless work of running a household and raising children makes enormously difficult. Hildegard understood this. Julian understood this. Christina of Marchiate in her cramped hiding places was protecting not just a religious vow, but the conditions that made a certain kind of inner life possible. The modern woman who decides not to have children is sometimes accused of selfishness. The medieval woman who chose the convent was sometimes accused of the same thing, of prioritizing her own soul over her family's social and financial needs. The accusation has the same structure across 9 centuries, and the response, I would suggest, also has the same structure. Some things require the whole of you, and choosing to give the whole of you to one thing rather than dividing it among many is not selfishness. It is a decision about where your one life is going to go. I want to pause here and ask you something that I genuinely don't know the answer to. Do you think the women in this story, the ones who chose or found the convent, were happy? Not all of them, obviously. We've heard from Tara Botti. We've heard from the woman who described herself as suffocating. But the ones who chose Hildegard, who lived to 81 and kept working until almost the end. Claire, who held out for 40 years for the privilege of poverty and got it one day before she died. The Beguines of Cologne, who built a life outside every sanctioned structure and sustained it for generations. Were they happy? I don't know. Happiness is not well documented in medieval sources, but I noticed that the women who chose the ones for whom the convent or the beguinage or the anchorite cell was genuinely their choice tend to appear in the historical record as people of unusual completeness, not people without struggle or sorrow, but people who seem to have known at some fundamental level what they were doing and why. And I find myself thinking that this might be the closest thing to a definition of the good life that history consistently shows us. Not happiness exactly, but coherence. The sense that the life you are living is the one that actually belongs to you. There is a researcher whose work I have found genuinely useful in thinking about all of this, a scholar named Sharon Strocchia, who has studied women in Renaissance Italian convents in detail. Her research documents something that I think complicates the standard narrative about convent life in interesting ways. She found that in many Italian convents of the 15th and 16th centuries, women ran sophisticated networks of patronage and influence that extended well beyond the convent walls. Nuns maintained connections to their families of origin. They served as points of contact for family business dealings. They influenced inheritance decisions. They acted as intermediaries in social disputes. They maintained correspondence networks that kept them at the center of their social worlds, even from behind the grill. In other words, the clausura, however strict in theory, did not in practice cut women off from the world. It changed their relationship to the world, made it more mediated, more deliberate, more dependent on the written word and the careful conversation through the parlour grill, but not less real. And Strockia's work suggests that for many of these women, the convent was not a withdrawal from the social world so much as a different way of inhabiting it. A way that offered certain protections and certain freedoms precisely because it operated from a position slightly outside the conventional social order. Which is, when I think about it, a description that applies to a remarkable number of the women we have met throughout this whole story, slightly outside the conventional social order, finding the available space, using it with extraordinary ingenuity and determination. Here's what I want to say about all of this, and then we are almost at the end. I've spent a long time with this history, more time than I expected to when I first started pulling on the threads. And what has stayed with me, what I cannot quite let go of, is not any single figure, not any single story, though I love all of them. It is the pattern itself, the pattern of women across centuries and cultures and completely different institutional contexts, doing the same fundamental thing, looking at the world they were born into, identifying with sometimes startling clarity the gap between what that world offered them and what they actually were, and then, with whatever tools were available, however imperfect, however constrained, doing something to close that gap. Not always successfully, not always without cost, not always in ways that look triumphant from a distance, but persistently, with a persistence that is, I think, one of the most under-acknowledged features of human history. And that persistence has a voice. It is Julian's voice writing from her small cell in Norwich that all shall be well. It is Marguerite's voice continuing to circulate her book after she'd been told to stop. It is Tara Botti's voice naming tyranny from inside the walls of the institution that practiced it. It is the voice of the unnamed scribe in the scriptorium, copying out a text by lamplight, absorbing it word by word into the fabric of her thinking. It is the voice of the young woman in the Korean apartment who has looked at the available options and decided quietly to build something different. All of them saying in their different languages and their different centuries, I am more than the role that was prepared for me, and I intend to prove it. We are almost at the end of this story, one chapter left. And it is the one I have been saving, not because it is the most dramatic, though it is moving, not because it has the most extraordinary figure, though the woman at its centre is extraordinary, but because it is the chapter about what we do with all of this, what we take away, what we carry forward from 900 years of women who found their way through stone walls and locked doors and the slow grinding weight of a world that was not built with them in mind. What it means to receive that inheritance, and what we owe to the women who left it for us. That is where we are going. Right now, we have travelled a long way tonight, from the stone-cold arithmetic of medieval marriage contracts to the candlelit scriptoria where women bent over parchment and changed the world one careful word at a time. From Christina hiding in a barn for years to protect a vow she made at 14, to Claire dying one day after she finally held official approval of the rule she had fought for across 4 decades. From the Beguines building entire cities of women's community out of nothing but determination and mutual trust, to Tara Botti writing her fury into permanence from inside walls she never chose. From Hildegard paralysed in her bed by divine command, or by sheer force of will depending on how you read it, until the men in authority finally got out of her way. We've been in the company of extraordinary people tonight, and I want to close by saying something about what I think that company actually means. Let me take you back to Norwich. The year is somewhere around 1413. Julian is in her cell. She's been there for perhaps 40 years. The city outside her window has survived plague political upheaval, a peasant rebellion that swept through Norfolk with particular intensity, and the slow, grinding poverty that defines most medieval urban life. She has seen people come to her window seeking counsel in their grief and their confusion and their fear. She has written and rewritten and refined and thought and prayed. and somewhere in these decades of thinking she arrived at something. Not a simple answer. She was too honest for simple answers, but a conviction. Hard-won, carefully examined, tested against everything she had seen of human suffering and human resilience, and the relentless complexity of being alive in a world that does not always make sense. She wrote it down in words so plain and so perfect that they have been quoted and painted on walls, and set to music and whispered over hospital beds, and tattooed on skin for more than 600 years. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. I have thought about those words a great deal while putting this story together, because on the surface they sound almost impossibly gentle for everything we have covered tonight. All shall be well, tell that to Marguerite standing in the Place de Grève in June of 1309. Tell that to Tara Botti counting the decades inside Santa Anna. Tell that to the thousands of women who sat in convent parlours watching the outside world through a grill and feeling the weight of a life they had not chosen. Does all shall be well apply to them? And I think the answer, Julian's answer if I understand her rightly, is yes, but not in a cheap dismissive way, not in the way that papers over suffering with optimism. Julian wrote at length about sin and pain and the apparent abandonment of God in human experience. She did not blink at any of it. She looked at the full horror of what suffering could mean, and she did not turn away. Her all shall be well was not the statement of someone who had not seen darkness. It was the conclusion of someone who had seen everything she could see from a small cell in a turbulent century, and who had thought and prayed and searched with every intellectual and spiritual tool available to her and arrived somehow at something that held. That is a very different kind of reassurance than the cheap kind. It is the reassurance of someone who has done the work. And here is what I want to say about all the women in this story in the end. Every single one of them did the work. Hildegard composed 77 original pieces of music while managing 2 convents, and corresponding with half of Europe and writing books about theology and medicine and natural history, and inventing a language. She did the work. Julian spent 40 years in a small room thinking about one experience, turning it over and over, until she had extracted every grain of meaning from it, and then writing it down in the first book in the English language known to be authored by a woman. She did the work. The unnamed scribes in the scriptoria sat down every day with their quills and their parchment, and copied the accumulated knowledge of their civilization word by careful word, preserving texts that would otherwise have been lost to us entirely. They did the work. Marguerite wrote a book about love and kept circulating it even when the cost became clear. She did the work. Tara Botti wrote her anger into something that outlasted her by 4 centuries. She did the work. Christina hid in a barn for years and came out the other side and became someone people sought out from a great distance because of what she knew. She did the work. The Beguines of Ghent and Cologne built communities out of nothing, sustained them for generations, and in doing so demonstrated something the institutional church found profoundly threatening, that women given half a chance are entirely capable of organizing themselves. They did the work. I want to say one more thing about the medieval convent before we close, and it is something that I think gets overlooked in the broader cultural conversation about this history. The convent, for all its contradictions and limitations and genuine injustices, kept something alive during a period when it might otherwise have been extinguished. It kept alive the idea that a woman's inner life, her intellectual life, her spiritual life, her creative life was worth taking seriously, worth time, worth resources, worth protection. In a world that had very few institutional frameworks for that idea, the convent was one of the few places where it was taken as a given rather than treated as a luxury or an aberration. That is not nothing. That is in fact an enormous thing, and we are the inheritors of it. Every woman today